they've done studies that showed that out of all of these psychedelic substances, whether it's ketamine or 5-MeO-DMT or ayahuasca or salvia divinorum, ketamine was the most likely to produce kind of this experiential near-death experience.
3, 2, 1. Lift off.
Welcome back to the Ketamine Startup Podcast. This is where we talk about how to start up a ketamine infusion clinic, market it, and much more. Today's episode is actually a special collaboration with Dr. Carl Bonnet, who is the CEO and medical director over at Klarisana. He and I had a very fascinating discussion regarding Matthew Perry, the concept of ego death, near death, and kind of our thoughts on this. So this is a special release that will be both coming out on Dr. Carl Bonnett's YouTube channel, as well as our YouTube channel, as well as this podcast. So stay tuned and learn more.
Hey everybody, my name is Carl Bonnett. For those of you who don't know me, I am the founder and medical director of Klarisana. And today I've got Dr. Sam Coe, a fellow emergency physician, and he is the founder and medical director of Reset Ketamine in Palm Springs, California. And Sam and I have been colleagues and working in the ketamine space for, I think, over 7 years now. He also runs the Ketamine Startup course, which is an outstanding educational opportunity teaching clinicians how to set up their own ketamine clinic and how to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that both Sam and I have painfully experienced over the last few years. So, Sam, thanks for being here, man.
Carl, it is such an honor and pleasure to be with you, a fellow emergency medicine colleague in this psychedelic/ketamine space. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's great to talk to you, and looking forward to the conversation today.
Excellent.
Cool. So, hey, what I want to talk to you about today, Sam, is Matthew Perry. And I know Matthew Perry's been in the news a lot. It's kind of, the hot thing to talk about him and ketamine and whatnot. But my concern is, one of the things that's been talked about with him a lot is his view of the death of the ego. If you look at his autobiography, he said, I'll quote right now, I'm looking at my other screen, as the music played, the K ran through me. It all became about the ego and the death of the ego. Now, a lot of us in the ketamine space do talk about ego death and ego disruption and whatnot. But my concern is that people may read that quote retrospectively now and be like, oh, what is this witchcraft? What are we talking about with the death of the ego and whatnot? So I want to get your opinion. Like in your practice, does disruption of the ego, death of the ego, quote unquote, is that a desirable thing? Is that something you use therapeutically? Like, what are your thoughts, man?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, when someone says the word ego, like, well, what are they talking about? Because we have like the Freudian definition of ego where I don't know if you remember from like psychology courses back in the days, you had like the superego and the ego and the id. So there's kind of like the psychological definition. But I'm assuming with Matthew Perry, it's more of kind of like everyday languaging. So ego referring to the sense of self or self-esteem. And so we can talk about someone who has, a big ego, right? Kind of arrogant, kind of all in their own head, or someone who has like a healthy ego. And when Matthew Perry was speaking about death of the ego, I'm assuming, going back to this definition, I think it was that sense of self. And at least at our clinic, sometimes it can be useful to have that kind of death of the ego, assuming, that sense of self, because when someone's sense of self dissolves, and of course this is temporary, it's not a permanent thing, it's during the ketamine infusion at the clinic with, monitoring and everything, they're going to return back. And they may get a renewed sense of who they truly are. And so if someone has a default mode way of thinking, we refer to that as the default mode network. And maybe that default mode is not as healthy as can be. And sometimes need to reset that and create some new neural grooves and pathways.
Yeah. Yeah. It's unfortunate. I wish he had actually, written about it more, to get a better understanding of where he's coming from. What does he mean by that? Because like I think you alluded to, like, when we talk about, death of the ego, I mean, it's a figure of speech, and we're talking about, destroying a quote unquote, a maladaptive part of your psyche and a part of your code, so to speak, to use a computer analogy that's not beneficial and just not constructive. But like, we're certainly not talking about anything related to actual, death. And I kind of get the sense that he was I don't know, maybe like engaging more in escapism, the idea of just, I want to get out of the world and whatnot. And I mean, I don't know. What do you think of that? Was he just trying to kind of?
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating because, just to recap the story about Matthew Perry is, I believe back in the pandemic, and I think this is in his autobiography, he was actually in Switzerland getting intravenous ketamine at a clinic that specializes in substance use disorders. Mm-hmm. So when he was speaking about this ego death, I believe he was referring to his experiences at that ketamine clinic where, I'm assuming he was with medical professionals and getting his vital signs checked and et cetera. So, if someone going to this word escapism, if someone has a sense of self that is not very healthy and they just don't like themselves, or there's a lot of self-hatred or self-worth issues, and that's their default mode way of thinking, then it can be useful. But I do want to add the caveat of, something you and I spoke about previously, is this concept of integration, right? So, all right, let's say someone does have death of the ego or even like a near-death experience, which ketamine can produce. I think I sent you the scientific article, which we can link in the podcast show notes, or someone can look it up. But they've done studies that showed that out of all of these psychedelic substances, whether it's ketamine or 5-MeO-DMT or ayahuasca or salvia divinorum, ketamine was the most likely to produce kind of this experiential near-death experience. So I think that's fascinating in itself.
Yeah. That's amazing. Just like like anything else, it just kind of seems that the power of something like that to do something beneficial is amazing. Something that can destroy a part of your psyche. But again, like you said, unchecked, that's very frightening, especially like later in his life. Unfortunately, towards in the final chapter, he was just kind of had his assistant injecting him and whatnot. But to think about doing that without integration, without whatnot is just frightening. Yesterday I was talking to one of our patients. He's a Marine Corps veteran, a combat veteran. Has been through he was a real deal. This guy was a real door kicker and in kind of a bad headspace. And he did his third session and he was kind of scared. He was just like, the first two sessions, he was sort of reaching out to grab things and have this imagery of him as a child. And on his third one, he was terrified. I wasn't there. I was talking to our staff who were at the clinic, and he had reported that he had emptiness. There was nothing but emptiness in his mind. And he was just like, oh my gosh, what do I do with this? And then, luckily my team worked with him and said, look, this is what we want to do. We want to wipe this clean. You now have emptiness. It's like you walked into your garage and all of a sudden all that stuff is gone, all the junk and the whatever. So work with it. And that was huge. That made a huge difference for him. So I can't imagine just getting injected with ketamine in your backyard or whatever, and just at your own, basically PRN, treating it as a PRN medication. But is that what you found? With regards to the integration and that just context that you have to give this in?
Yeah. And also you bring up something really important, which is preparation, right? Like letting the person know that this is what they may experience. And, going back to your patient who had a clear mind, I think about Buddhism, for example, when people are in these long, deep meditations, that's kind of their goal, is to have no mind. And if someone is not anticipating or aware that this could potentially occur during the infusion, I imagine it can be quite scary. They've done some studies where they took healthy volunteers and they put them on EEGs, which are electroencephalogram, patterns of the brain. And what they found were that patients who were receiving intravenous ketamine, or just ketamine in general, they actually started entering the same exact brainwave physiology as long-term meditators who had been doing it for 10, 20 years. So in a way, that patient who experienced this, state of no mind, or, someone may call it a state of Satori or Zen, that can be useful because, the mind is a great tool, but also it can be a terrible master. Mm-hmm. And we want to use the mind, not necessarily be the tool for the mind.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's just so unfortunate, man. It's just to hear what he went through and to hear that ketamine being given, because you and I know, we've been doing this for a long time, right? The number of lives you've saved. I half jokingly say that I've saved more lives 9 years of psychedelic medicine that I did in 22 years of emergency medicine. This is rock and roll. But to hear that it's not, the way it was administered is just so, I mean, it's criminal, obviously. So and I think that'll probably play out. And to me, I can't remember which, I think it's one of the newer fighter planes. I can't remember if it's the F-22. The people out there know way more about this than I do, but there's something about it where, like, if the computer doesn't stabilize it, there's like no way for the pilot to keep it under control. It requires this extra stabilization. So, like, just, my God, to think of like some guy, I mean, I was reading the story of like how he said to his assistant, oh, inject me in the morning and I'm going to go play pickleball or something. Inject me one more time. Then he's just like, hey, give me the big one. I'm going to go take a swim. It's like, just, it's tragic.
It really is, because it really ignores all the crucial components of ketamine therapy. There's the preparation, there's the intention, there's the set and the setting and the experience with medical professionals, as well as the integration. So it's a very sad story, and it's kind of embarrassing and shameful in a way, because you may or may not know this, but one of the doctors who was indicted and actually I think recently pleaded guilty was a fellow emergency physician. So it's another thing. It's like, oh my gosh, what was he thinking?
Yeah.
And, I think about ketamine as a tool, and the tool can be incredibly powerful. It can be incredibly useful, but also it can be dangerous. Like, as a metaphor, because I love metaphors, if you think about fire, right? Like, fire can be an incredibly useful tool when we have a piece of meat, or we want to cook some chicken, or, cook a steak on the grill. Like, yes, that fire can be really useful, but at the same time, that same exact fire can burn down millions, hundreds of square feet of forest and, start burning down homes. So it's like, we have a really powerful tool. How can we use it in the most effective, safe, and responsible way? Because it can potentially turn into a wildfire that can be devastating.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think, the quote I heard, the fire can cook a person's meal or can cook the person, right? Like, and it's just, oh man. So what, I guess moving forward from here then, like, what are you hearing from your patients? Is there anything I know you've been doing an incredible job from the get-go. But is there anything you're changing as far as your practice in light of some of this and other, bad publicity about ketamine?
I think the biggest thing is education, because you and I and, some of the viewers may know about ketamine therapy and its regular medical professional use. But when someone hears the word ketamine in general, and then they associate it with this, really sad, unfortunate news with Matthew Perry and illegal behavior, it kind of taints the entire industry. So I think the crucial component is education as much as we can, and say, hey, there's, really responsible ways to do this. And it is a powerful tool. Remember, it is a general anesthetic. And there's very irresponsible ways to use this. And I think clearly delineating between, responsible versus irresponsible, normal medical use versus non-medical recreational use. Those are two completely different things. And I think that discernment between those two is really important to share.
If you tuned in to our episode today, chances are you're curious about the ins and outs of starting up a ketamine clinic. It's an exciting field, but let's face it, the journey from idea to actually opening day can be quite daunting. That's why we've created something special for you. Think of it as your personal roadmap, a free downloadable checklist that lays out the essential steps you need to consider when starting up your ketamine clinic. This checklist is designed to help you avoid common pitfalls and launch your trajectory to success. So how can you get your hands on this checklist? Simple. Just visit www.ketaminestartup.com/checklist and grab your free copy today. We've made it easy and accessible because we believe in supporting our community with a valuable resource. ketaminestartup.com/checklist. All right, let's get back to our discussion. Stay tuned and don't forget to download your free checklist during or after the podcast.
Yeah, it kind of struck me today. There's obviously a lot of like legalization moves going on in the country, to decriminalize, to legalize various substances, which at an ethical level, I don't necessarily, I'm a libertarian. People can do whatever they want. But, do you think that this will feed into that discussion, into that dialogue as far as like, should certain things be available over the counter or at dispensaries and whatnot? What would go into your mindset as far as your calculus, I suppose, as far as, hey, what should be regulated, what should be legal?
I mean, that policy discussion may be over my pay grade.
Yeah.
But, I will, there was an example of, I think it was an airline pilot. You may have heard about this, who took some psilocybin because he had heard all this great news about it for depression. And apparently this pilot was suffering from depression, couldn't really tell anyone about it because as a pilot, that's like, they kind of get like a red mark for expressing their desire and needs for mental health. Anyways, this pilot took psilocybin with some buddies at a camping trip. And then like 3 days later, I think he was in an airplane, a passenger, and like tried opening the emergency exit door. Do you remember hearing this story?
I did not. No, I didn't actually.
Okay. So again, this is like with psilocybin, which there are, FDA, I think they're in phase 2 trials. There's some studies coming out and its use for depression and even like publications in the New England Journal of Medicine. So these substances and psychedelics, whether it's psilocybin, ayahuasca, ketamine, etc. Again, these are really powerful tools. And it goes down into like, how can we use it responsibly? And I don't care what drug it is. I mean, it could be cocaine or it could be fentanyl. Like, we know those can be dangerous, but sometimes if someone has a femur fracture, I want to give them 50 micrograms, 100 micrograms of IV fentanyl in the emergency department setting with the very intentional use. Because if someone is in a lot of pain and let's say they have, I don't know, like a severe fracture or burn or car accident, like we're administering it very safely. So again, I think it's using this wisdom and discernment of like, how can we use it in a regulated, responsible way, and also know that it's not going to be used. Some people may take it onto the streets and cause overdoses and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking about last night was, because this whole Matthew Perry and everything, there's all these news reports. It's pretty rare for this to occur. Right. And we know that ketamine has been administered billions of times. It's on the World Health Organization's essential list of important medications at any healthcare system. It's used every day in hospitals, internationally, in the United States, in every country. And so the fact that Matthew Perry and all of this has gotten so much news, I think in a way highlights how rare it is. It's kind of like, when you hear about a great white shark attack, like that's pretty rare, but when it does occur, like there's all these news reports about it.
Yeah.
So I would also let the, people who are listening, like, yeah, it can occur, but it's, quite rare for this to actually occur. And I think you're doing a study on this with clinics and how often they have to call, emergency medical services.
Yeah. We're trying to do a retrospective survey of all these, as many clinics as we can, just to ask how many times did you actually call 911 and transport someone medically? How many times did you have to use advanced airway equipment? And the hypothesis being that it's super, super rare. So it does bring just a ton of attention, which is so unfortunate that people don't pick up on that someone, the movie star ends up face down in a pool and it's horrible. It's catastrophic. But come on, how many people die of car crashes every year? How many people die of fentanyl overdose every year? I mean, it's so it is a safe medication. And that's what I'm hoping is that the more we have these kind of dialogues to bring it out to people, that look, I mean, the number of lives it saves is far greater than the number of lives that it takes. And even in this case, it just highlights it. Yeah, it's a legit medication. I mean, it's got to be done in a safe environment, man. I'll bring you on. We'll do another whole talk about home ketamine and all that. But man, there's a lot of other avenues where this is very risky. So,
yeah, you bring up a good point in that ketamine can be safe when used appropriately, but at the same time, when used inappropriately, it can be unsafe. And I think that's why patients and people who are interested in considering this, it's like, yeah, it can be safe, but just make sure you're doing it with medical professionals who know what they're doing versus, with someone who's untrained in a jacuzzi. Like that can be very dangerous in itself.
Yeah. Bad idea. All right, Sam. So as always, thank you so much for your time today. This was a great discussion. And, I want to close by saying that, my heart goes out to Matthew Perry's family, really. I mean, the purpose of making this video and some of the other videos in this series is not in any way to make light of what happened to him, but rather to use that unfortunate experience to sort of show how ketamine can be done well, how it can actually save lives, and if it's being done in the context of clinics such as yours, and hopefully people feel mine, it can be just a very powerful tool. So, Sam, thanks so much for being a part of this discussion. And any last thoughts on that before we go into some of the how people can get a hold of you?
Well, I just want to give you a shout out, Carl, because all the education and information that you're putting out there for patients, I think it's really important. You definitely have the background and the experience in the space. You've been doing it for, quite a long time. So I think it's important for experienced clinicians and physicians like yourself to get this information out there. So thank you for all of your hard work. Really love all the videos that you're making and sharing with general public.
For any clinicians out there, just so you know that this space is getting crowded, and there's a lot of competition, a lot of people in it. So if you're brave enough to want to jump into the fray, give Sam's website a look, and consider the training course that it can really put you quite ahead of the power curve as far as getting up and running. So awesome! Thanks again, Sam. We'll talk to you soon.
All right,
see you on the next
video.
Take
care. Hey, just wanted to do a quick bounce back. I finished the podcast interview with Dr. Carl Bonnet from Klarisana. And yeah, just had a few extra thoughts about the concept of near-death experiences and ego death. And, one of the interesting things about ketamine is it does create non-ordinary states of consciousness, which basically means, some people will feel like empathogenic. They might feel a sense of universal connection. They might have a past life review. Kind of like reaching the end of their life, near-death experience, ego death, etc., which was described by Dr. Eli Kolb. And he talked about these 4 different types of experiences that patients can have with ketamine administration. So what is the benefit of having a mystical or spiritual or these relaxed ego defenses or even ego dissolving? Well, I think it comes down to how one uses that information and that experience. Again, going back to this concept of integration, where someone will have this type of experience and we can use it in a positive way or in a negative way. So if someone's like, what? Nothing really matters in life. Now, that could be taken in one of 2 ways, where you become apathetic and you're just like, F it, I don't care about anything. Or you can say, maybe I need to be less concerned about the minor things. Maybe I don't need to be as stressed out about X, Y, and Z. So again, having the experience, making the meaning from that experience can be really an integral part of the ketamine therapy. On the interview, I touched upon this article that was done by Dr. Martial et al., talking about the semantic narratives of patients who actually had a near-death experience. So these are patients who really had, a cardiac arrest, a car accident, some sort of complication in the operating room, and they made it, and they actually wrote down or typed down what their experience was like. And then the researchers went to a website called arrowwood.org, where people write about their recreational ketamine experiences and psychedelic, experiences with MDMA and ayahuasca and et cetera, et cetera. And when they uploaded those into a software program, they found that the ketamine experience was very similar to the experiences that the patients who actually had an NDE, like that was almost exactly alike. And so the researchers in the study, they said, well, what is going on? And their hypothesis is that at the time of death, real death, that possibly the brain releases endogenous substances that are like ketamine, that are an NMDA receptor blocker, and which may explain why those experiences are so similar. The thing to wrap up and, just touch upon Matthew Perry, I think, again, it's really sad. It's really unfortunate. And it's, it was irresponsible. And just to reassure patients that when they come to the doctor's office, when they come to a clinic, at least here in Palm Springs, Reset Ketamine, like it's going to be done with the gold standard, the utmost integrity, continuous vital sign monitoring, just making it super safe, creating that healing environment, because ketamine can lead people to have very vulnerable open experiences. And we want to keep that sacred, protected container. That is really, really crucial as part of the ketamine therapy. Thanks so much for joining, and I will see you in the next episode.